week 5, we're going to complete our discussion and analysis of Jules Verne's Master of the World, with a group activity that will prepare you to face the next assignment, the next written assignment, which I'll discuss briefly at the very beginning of this class. On Thursday, I will discuss briefly a novel that we will not be reading from, The Black Motor Car by Iris Berlin, a British writer, an English writer, a novel that is similar in some ways to Jules Verne's novel, because it's all about a mad engineer who wants to enact a revenge on society and on people that this person knew in the past. And basically the idea is that this big, powerful car with a speed much higher than anything on the roads in England is able to subjugate the entire nation, to plunge England into terror and chaos until the hero, representing the good guys, the side of good in society, intervenes to stop this madness. On Thursday, we will also watch the first group of scenes from a nice horror comedy. I cannot define it more precisely because it's a very light horror movie with definitely elements of comedy by a masterful director, John Carpenter. The film is Christine from 1983. In fact, a remake has been announced for the past few years. Apparently, a remake is or will be soon in production because it was a small film but gained a lot of popularity. Another film in which we find a loser protagonist, this time a high school student, Arnie Cunningham, who is being bullied by others at school, has no prospects in terms of a romantic relationship or much else going on in his life, being oppressed at home by strict parents who treat him like a child. So you see some parallels with Bumblebee. And then Arnie one day sees this wreck of a car from the 1950s, and for mysterious reasons, Arnie sees something in this car, the same way that Charlie saw something in the Volkswagen Beetle, which was in fact B127. And Bumblebee takes it from the owner, in fact, the brother of the owner who died in mysterious circumstances, works on the car. And the more Arnie works on the car, and the more this transformation of the car is paralleled by a physical and psychological transformation. Arnie stops wearing glasses, becomes a greaser. We'll talk about greasers. And becomes the cool guy who's able to connect with the most beautiful female student in his school. But soon enough, there will be a descent into a hellish kind of chaos because the car Arnie has bonded with is this time not a good creature, but it's a vehicle inhabited by some kind of demonic spirit. The film was based on a novel by Stephen King. Before I talk about the next assignment, which is due 2 weeks from now on October 3rd, which is a Friday of next week, let me just tell you that I finally got to work on your assignments. So if you haven't received a notification through Google, go check your Google Docs file. I did most of the second assignments, all of those that centered on presenting a video on an older car and then a video on a newer car and analyzing, discussing the reactions of those who are driving the car in the video or standing beside the car in it, their body language, their emotions, and altogether how, for them, how it feels to be driving or be experiencing an old car and a new car. I left those who did the alternative assignment because I wanted to be consistent to go through all of this. And then I started on the first assignment after that, which is about cars and whether or not they've lost their magic, but I still have to complete the correction of those assignments. Next on my agenda will be posting grades for your participation. The next assignment has to do with the Master of the World, and it's an assignment that requires the analysis of the text. The first step would be to select relevant passages, episodes, moments in the novel, and the next step would be to provide commentary to discuss the theme. The theme is fear and fascination of new technologies. I call them fast technologies because you know that the terror, the machine invented by Robert, is not exactly an automobile. It's part automobile, part plane, part boat, part submarine. But all of those different devices, all of those modalities of mobility, they're all associated with speeds that are unprecedented in that kind of society. Although when we put a number next to it, we're talking about 150 miles or so, which would be the speed of a lot of regular cars being sold on the market nowadays. As usual, it's between 300 and 600 words, and focus on specific examples. You can also include quotes. Of course, if you include quotes, which is my recommendation, in order to then develop your discussion, your analysis, expand the minimum from 300 upward so that your assignment is not just 300 and then 100 of those words are quotes. Be mindful of that. And the suggestions you find here really apply to other assignments as well. When you have a short assignment, don't worry about having a formal paragraph where you introduce the premise and state a thesis. And you shouldn't have a conclusion, especially a conclusion where you just summarize what you just wrote. It's a short assignment. So start from an example that is powerful and introduce the themes of that example and then analyze the example. Again, the general theme is fear and fascination, attraction to the technology, or rejection of the technology. But of course, fear and fascination can take multiple forms. So it's up to you also to redefine and customize the topic based on your selection of passages. Don't make it a comprehensive analysis of the novel. Just focus on specific situations or scenes. And as usual, this will be 3% of your final grade. Do you have any questions about the class in general, the organization of the class, the deadlines, before I proceed with my lecture? Okay. So, of course, as usual, what you see in here can be found in a presentation online on the class wiki called the Master of the World Notes and Quotes and more. You find more than the slides that I have included in here just to give you a rough idea of the kind of work we're doing with this novel and the kind of work that you'll be doing on your assignment. So this is the summary of the things that we're looking for. We're looking at the text, and therefore we're interested in the style adopted by the French writer Jules Verne. And in simple terms, the style has a lot of passages where the author speculates about the future. This is not unusual in entertainment literature to this day. That is to say, instead of proceeding to the next action, the next scene, the narrator will stop and consider what might happen and various kinds of dilemmas. And these dilemmas serve the purpose of increasing the tension with the reader by suggesting to the reader that things might go bad, and if things go bad, there would be severe consequences. So it's a way to pause the narrative, pause the action, introduce a reflection that creates a mood in the reader and also creates the possibility of darker outcomes to the next episode. At the lower level of text analysis, amplification and accumulation are typical of this kind of literature, and that's not limited to this particular writer. Amplification means the use of emphatic language. For example, it'll be the immense abyss of the mountain where people believe an eruption is about to explode and kill them all. And accumulation would be just some kind of list, which is either a list of items in a group. For example, if people are running away because they believe that lava will be coming their way and will be burying their homes and kill them, instead of saying that people are running away, the author might say men, women, children, they're animals. And instead of saying animals, they name all the kinds of animals that you can find in a farm in North Carolina, or the animals that this French writer expects to be found in such a place. The themes that we're looking for, that we'll find specifically in those passages, are, first of all, the theme of control. And we said how Verne has a negative perception of any advanced technology. So the theme of control becomes the theme of lack of control. Who's in control of this advanced technology? And if the majority of people, as well as their governments, are powerless in front of this new technology, then society will precipitate into anarchy or chaos, especially if the person managing this technology is someone who appears to be after power, but also somebody who is not grounded in traditional morality, someone who did not come out of society, meaning not someone who came out of academia, not someone who came out of the scientific community or the industrial community, but someone external to society, suggesting the idea of anarchy, right? An element who is external to society because they don't agree, they don't comply with societal rules. To charge the narrative with negative connotations before the technology is presented, which is typical also of films. And you know in advance that the technology will be presented, because the moment you start flipping through the pages, you find pictures of this technology, pictures of the terrors, you find premonitions and ominous signs, so signs of impending doom. And the emotion generated by the arrival in society of this technology are all connected to the idea of danger and risk, so fear and surprise and other kinds of negative behaviors performed by individuals or by entire community. And of course, this mysterious technology that is withheld from the knowledge of society and therefore tries to escape assessment and proper judgment from society, this suggests that perhaps it would be wiser to reject this technology altogether, which is interesting. As we said, it's not altogether, even though the representation is moralistic, it is still appropriate for us to reflect on this idea that technologies can be debated and accepted or rejected in society, rather than placing ourselves just in the roles of consumers and being passive about the introduction on the market of certain technologies. And we discussed the parallels with the AI debate last week. The fact that this is a moralistic book, a book with a strong sense of what is good, what is bad, and a moral lesson to teach the reader is apparent from the very first pages. For example, look at the premise from the narrator. In the remarkable passages of the recital of the narrative, it is important that you, the reader, should believe my word. Right? So the book is being presented not as something that you go through for entertainment, but something that you find useful for your reflection, for your view of life. For some of the facts, I can bring no other testimony than my own. This is the voice of John Schrock, the federal agent who will be taken on board the Terror and then be offered the option of joining the crew of the Terror and its inventor, and after a moment of serious reflection will come to his senses and try to destroy and stop this technology. If you do not wish to believe me, so be it. There should be a period here. I can scarce believe myself. What's interesting about this is one of the oldest techniques to provide the credentials for a narrative. That is to say, to imply, you suggest that the narrative is true and therefore the moral lesson should be considered more seriously. Both in classical literature, in texts from antiquity, such as the Gospels, there is this idea that anything that has a qualified, believable eyewitness should be considered true. That reading something that comes from someone who participated and experienced the facts that are about to be narrated implies that there is something true at the core of the narrative, and that the narrative has an implied or an explicit lesson. That is true of many texts. I mentioned the Gospels, for example. At the beginning of the Gospel of John, you find two of the apostles meeting with Jesus, right? Implying that the Gospel is the result of a group of people who experience the figure and the life of Jesus, and therefore they can testify about it either directly or through a chain of people who know Jesus, people who knew the apostles, who knew Jesus, etc. But even when you take the books written by Julius Caesar about his war with the Gauls and about the civil war in Rome, that's the idea in the book. This book comes from the point of view of an eyewitness, of a protagonist, and therefore it should be believed, and therefore it serves a higher moral purpose. The act of reading leads to some serious lesson to be learned. In here you find an example of passages where the narrator, instead of moving on with the narrative, is speculating about the possible reasons why people are experiencing strange natural signs. And people believe that there is a volcano, and instead of moving forward and revealing whether or not it's a volcano, the narrative stops to consider all the possible options. And that's why you find language such as was not this, right? Instead of saying this was or wasn't, was not this with a question mark. And then might not the Great Erie, which is a fictional mountain invented by Vernon, placed in North Carolina, which is believed to be the site of this dormant volcano, might not the Great Erie reproduce, and then a question mark. And an if clause to follow, if there were indeed a central lake, and then the consequences. And I tried to organize with the bullet points to show you the dilemmatic directions of the narrative, how everything develops into a possible scenario or a series of hypotheses. Consider also that the constant references to the possibility of the signs being related to nature, some kind of natural event, is relevant for the theme of the book as a whole, because the idea is that the relationship between man and nature has been codified through times and in traditional texts, religious texts, and texts by writers, texts about politics, right? Nature suggests by itself the issue of control, because nature, in the traditional view, is basically divided into two realms. One is the natural phenomena that escape control by humans, for example, eruptions. And there, the only solution is to escape, right? To vacate an area that is about to invested by molten lava or rocks exploding from a volcano, as in the case of the eruption of the Vesuvius in Roman times. And then there is a part of nature controlled by humans. But the part of nature controlled by humans, the kind of control exerted on that part of nature brings with it the need for government and for leadership at the local level, at the regional level, at the national level. So this confusion between technology and nature, the fact that the signs of the arrival of this technology, the manifestation of this technology, is confused with a part of nature that escapes human control, suggests that new technologies should be feared, and that either new technologies are able to be controlled not by individuals, but also by different branches of the government, different levels of government, from the micro to the macro level of government, implies that technologies can be good or bad, depending on how they're integrated into society, which is, again, a different perspective compared to our view of technologies within just the commercial, the economic market. A new product that can be successful or less, more successful or less successful. Of course, if you go online, that you'll find whenever there are references, I place links. I don't know if you're familiar with Mount Krakatoa, was one of the greatest eruptions in modern history, happened in Indonesia in 1883, whereas Mount Pelée was in Martinique, in a French island in the Caribbean, and it was an eruption that happened in 1902. So the memory of those eruptions were fresh in the minds of readers in 1904. That had happened within 2 to 21 years before the publication of the novel. These are the symptoms, right? These are the signs of the arrival of this mysterious technology that are mistaken for signs of natural phenomenon that escape human control, such as an eruption. Smoke above the mountain, subterranean noises, unexplained rumblings. As I said, the mountain, the top of that mountain has been chosen by Robert as its shop to work on this vehicle, and he has no trouble reaching the top of that mountain because the vehicle can fly. Glow in the sky, because of course they're working, they're welding, they're forging parts with metal. And you see here the next part, the next section is about lack of control. So nothing apparently can be done to ascertain the origin of these signs because nobody has been able in the fictional narrative to climb this mountain in North Carolina in 1904. And it's a typical outdated idea of nature being full of exotic places, places that have escaped exploration by humans and therefore could hide secrets, right? No mountain climbers have ever been there, no path to climb that, okay? And again, the prospect of a speculative, hypothetical scenario if a volcanic eruption menaces all the western regions, and then the consequences are developed, which really is unnecessary to the arc of the story, to stop and contemplate storylines, developments that will not come to fruition because this is not a volcano. These are not natural phenomena. Then they come up with the idea of sending a hot air balloon on top of the mountain with somebody with a telescope to observe down and see if there are signs of a volcano that is waking up or something else. But instead, again, of just offering you, the readers, the story of this mission with an hot air balloon, they go through the entire plan. So again, they stop to formulate how this might go, right? Which is typical of this kind of narrative, and it's meant to increase tension. It's meant to suggest that, yes, there are plans, but if I'm telling you about the plans, it's because things will not go according to plans. And in fact, this will not happen. The mission will fail. When the people as a community at different levels of society, especially the lower levels of society, are brought into the narrative, then the issue of control comes out from the fact that the assumption in this conservative view of society is that the lower you go into the strata of society, and the less people are able to control their emotions and respond to good input as opposed to manipulative input. So there are strange phenomena, and people become disquieted, meaning they react emotionally rather than rationally. And then they have this defined as imperious need of knowing the true condition of the mountain, but there is no actual initiative or any kind of leadership displayed in society, because the assumption is that the lower levels of society, at the lower level of society, the bottom of society, citizens are not able to enact a proper plan to react to something like this. The newspapers are just, of course, trying to sell as many copies as possible by suggesting that there is a mystery and there is something dangerous. They're just trying to produce curiosity and fear, emotions that are not positive for society as a whole. And you see curiosity and fear mentioned here, and then you have two parts, segments of this period being assigned to each to expand, right? Amplification, accumulation is the process. More ominous signs, right? This is repeated several times during the first few chapters. Rumblings, heavy clouds, again, glimmering of lights, and people descend into chaos. So you have the beginning here of the realization that there might be an imminent danger, and the culmination is at the end of this paragraph with the mention of panic. But panic implies that people in the local communities need guidance and leadership, because if left by themselves, they will just have this kind of animalistic reactions to any threat posed to their community. So this supports a vertical view of society where society cannot survive or will descend into chaos without a strong leadership and without proper information, where the newspapers can be either on the side of good or on the opposite side, whether they spread fear or whether they communicate the message coming from the leaders, right? So from panic, you get to public terror, and they're so convinced that an eruption is about to destroy their area, that the next time that they hear a sound from the mountain, they just assume that the mountain will be falling on them. Remember that there are two kinds of eruptions, one with lava, another where rocks will be shot into the air and then will fall to the ground and kill the people, as in the case of the famous eruption of Pompeii. So they left their houses. Fear drives them, right? And of course, you see sign of amplification. The immense abyss would be the crater created by an earthquake, and the idea that this phenomena will impact a large area. And this is the apex of this overly dramatic prose, because look at the references to impenetrable obscurity, people groping their way through the black roads. But what's wrong with this passage? What's strange about this passage? What's not realistic or reasonable about this passage? What is that makes it unnecessarily dramatic? What do you find inconsistent in logic? Even if you think of an American town in North Carolina in 1904.
Hearing any noise from the mountain and thinking
No, there is something more practical. Put yourself in those houses, right? Your assumption is that this time didn't happen the previous times, but this time the volcano will erupt and you have to escape. But would you find yourself in impenetrable obscurity, groping your way into black roads, even in 1904?
Would there be like some street lights, or?
Let's assume there are no street lights because these are rural roads, but would these people have any light with them, or be spending every night in complete obscurity?
No.
Yes, Colin.
Would it be just dark?
Pardon me?
And would it be just fully dark?
It could be dark if there is no moon, right? But these people would have torches, right? Would have fire. And if they have fire, they have candles, they have torches, they would not be just running out in complete darkness, right? They would have sources of light with them. This is just the author that is trying to place you, the reader, into a context that feels claustrophobic and oppressing, right? To transfer the fear from the page to your mind in a way that is not completely logical. Again, look at the signs of chaos and anarchy, the idea that this group as a group cannot organize themselves, cannot help themselves without proper guidance. Wild confusion, screaming voices, meaning overly emotional people, and people saying an earthquake, an eruption, and just bouncing ideas that precipitate everyone into chaos and fear. Once again, the narrating voice is speculating about different scenarios. Had a fire spontaneously broken out with a question mark, instead of telling you what is happening? To what cause was it due? And then the options for the answer to that question. Is it lightning? Well, lightning could not have started. And there is no material for fire, but the flames were too sudden for any ordinary cause. And then just, instead of proper reflection, an eruption, and the cry is repeated from all sides, again, an eruption, and people just flee, right? This is more, again, one of many instances in which this hypothetical eruption is being analyzed with its outcomes, and this is the reaction by the people. Panic, which is the key word that had been anticipated, but this time panic is overwhelming. The assumption being that these people don't have a rational mind and are in need of guidance. Nothing could stop it. And then you have the accumulation, examples of accumulation, where this crowd is broken into categories and each category is expanded with qualifiers. Women carrying their infants, crazed with terror, rush through the eastward roads. Men deserting their homes, deserting because they're not acting as proper leader of the house, right? They're relinquishing their proper role as leaders in that context, made hurried bundles of the most precious belongings, set free their livestock, cows, sheep, pigs, which fled in all directions. So their actions are chaotic and damaging to their own very properties. Panic, chaos, now we have disorder, right? Resulted from this agglomeration. But agglomeration is an aggregate of elements that is not organized, right? And once again, through the process, stylistic device of accumulation, you have the items in this agglomeration, human and animal, and the conditions under the darkest night, amid forests, threatened by the fires of the volcano, along the borders of marshes, etc. Right? Would they be in time to save themselves? Once again, with a question mark, debating the possible outcome to add tension to the narrative. At the end, some people recover their balance and their control, and this panic decreases because they notice that the flames are disappearing, that there are no follow-ups to the ominous signs, no stones being hurled into space from the mountain, no lava, no rumblings, etc. So this is the end of it, but it's not really the end of it, because now we go from the natural signs to the clearer signs that there is a machine. A strange noise swept across the air, a sort of whirring. These are the flaps, the wings of the terror being flapped, accompanied by the beating of mighty wings. And had it been a clear day, the people would have seen this mighty bird of prey. Bird of prey is a common metaphor used for planes during this period, right? But it's not a positive. Bird of prey shows the potential for aggression, but also there is an element of a positive element of nobility that can be attached to it, but then it is clearly defined in negative terms as a monster. Okay, so later on, it becomes clear that this technology exists, and people just have to understand the characteristics, the qualities of this technology. So little by little, they learn that this is some kind of extraordinary vehicle, but no one can describe the form, the nature, the size because of the speed. So the feature that identifies this vehicle is really the speed. They think it's an automobile, then they think it's multiple devices. They don't know who's driving it and where it comes from, right? And more question marks, more hypotheses are being suggested. The narration goes on to indicate that it is a technology that is foreign to society during that period because they don't know whether it is aligned with existing technologies. And when you look at this, automobiles driven by steam, gasoline, or electricity, keep in mind that the market for automobiles during that period, around 1904, was pretty much a third, and a third between these sources of fuel, of energy. about a third of the circulating fleet in the US would have been electrical vehicles, a third gasoline-powered vehicles, and a third steam-powered vehicles, which were very popular up until the 1920s. It was during the 1920s that steam-powered and electric-powered vehicles faded out and disappeared, to be rediscovered, to be relaunched later, starting with the 1990s with various experimental vehicles or small production vehicles. Okay? Of course, speed, being able of a speed exceeding 120 miles is what makes this vehicle different. And speed changes the way it interacts with nature, right? It's a rushing mass. It comes like a thunderbolt, produces a rumbling, causes a whirlwind that can tear the branches from the trees and terrifies the animals and produces dust, etc., right? And you find the rest of the consequences of this vehicle. The other thing is that they don't find any traces on the roads, on the dirt roads, where this vehicle is circulating of its passage, because the idea is that the speed is such that the vehicle becomes lighter. That speed changes the mass of the vehicle. So you really get this sense that speed is the identifying quality of this technology, and that speed, after a certain level, changes the interaction between the vehicle and the territory, right? Okay. So this is just the development of this. Again, there are no signs that this vehicle is really aligned with the technology of the period. Otherwise, you would smell gasoline, you would see smoke, you would see steam coming from vehicle. They think it's an electrical vehicle, has an electrical engine, and of course, the public goes again into a frenzy. What's interesting about this passage that tells you that people fantasize about this vehicle and they think it's driven by a specter, by a demon, chauffeur from hell, by a goblin, or some kind of monster. This kind of language would have been found in newspapers and literature of the time in reference to the automobile. That the belief being that people who were less educated reacted to the passage of the automobile in such a way, using this kind of language, believing that it was a kind of demonic technology. And it's not limited to the United States. We'll find a poem about an older woman in Italy where the woman thinks, if my mother, this is a woman born in the 19th century, if my mother, that is to say someone born at the beginning of the 19th century, would see these machines, she would think that there is a demon from hell driving them. And of course, the main issue is who's controlling this car, right? Because nobody gave this driver a permit. There is no number. The numbers on cars were the equivalent of the registration of today, would allow policemen and authorities to identify a car. So if you didn't stop at a speed trap, they would get the number on the car before a license plate was made compulsory. And of course, without a license. One of the characteristics of this machine, which we found in, as I was mentioning before, also in The Black Motor Car, this British novel from 1905, is that the machine seems to be ubiquitous. Because of the speed, the machine can be everywhere at once. So they sit in Kentucky, Ohio, Tennessee, Missouri, within such a small period of time that they think the machine can be everywhere at any time. So this was my introduction. As we've done other times, I'll be distributing these forms. Now, this time you can use both pages if needed, because as I will illustrate I would invite you to focus on finding passages that are relevant for the analysis of this book and for the homework assignment due on October 3rd. And you can either copy some passages or at least part of the passages and then put an ellipsis and indicate the pages and add some commentary. So I'll circulate this passage. So for the purpose of this assignment, you need to get your phone, tablet, or laptop and go find this page called The Terror Excerpts from the Master of the World. I suggest that using the table of content, you focus on chapters 13 through 15, but it's up to you. It's not a requirement. And then we want to see the protagonist, John Strock, who's a federal agent sent to stop Robert, the inventor of the terror, this machine. We need to see how the text conveys the federal officer's fascination with the new technology, and also, of course, his special connection, his admiration for the inventor of this technology, but also all his fears about this technology, and the suspicion that the technology could be used to wreak havoc in American society and inflict damage to the economy, to the orderly dealings of society. So find the passage and add a few comments. But the first thing would be to find material that you can then also use in your assignment. I recommend you work in groups because this way you can delegate the reading of different parts and find more quotes, and then you can confront each other around those quotes and discuss what analysis, what commentary, but it's really a low level of analysis. The idea is, can we find the evidence for the articulation of these themes in the book? What are the passages? What is the actual language, if it is a phrase, an adjective, a verb that is being used? Or how is a scene, a situation built to convey either fascination with the technology, this idea that a technology really draws you into it, right? It is not a rational interaction you have with the new technology. At some point, you capitulate, you surrender yourself to the power displayed by this technology and the fear that this technology also generates. Okay, so find passages where you can go from the text, from the language, to the understanding of the articulation of the themes.